Everybody around me see red. Everybody around me got one in the head. Shots pulled up, shooting, they fled. Shots pulled up, shooting, they was trying to fake dead. Fucked up, let me touch a little bread. Get too mad and I pay for some blood to be shed. Fuck your gang, you heard what I said. Before you cross me, I'm sleep on the bunk bed. Drake up, I take the carbon instead. Too geeked up, I'm crossing all with the man. Free cup, he threw up on the lick, he was scared. He step on shit, be quiet, no said. Shoot first the motto, you know how we paid. Them hollow to hungry, they ate up his leg. I was just dropping shit, look where it led. Now I'm in the hills, I can't spell where we stayed. I can't go out like I'm Tony, you can't sneak up on me. I got the whole world in my hand. Sad how we treat the opponents, I'm still undefeated when we talking body and bands. Next flight to Memphis, I slide when I land. You try to spin through, had to body your man. All of my bitches be too slant in. When I sick them on you, they begging you in. Been with the coolin' kid on the FN. I knew I was gon' catch a body at 10. Gotta hop out on feet every time that we spin. Wanna get with my gang called Delta to get in. Tryna reach for my chain, you all Memphis and me. They shot on right, turn the step with the C. First every time, better XIT. Got a day going out like Park on B. Everybody around me buying green. Then we big C gang, what the fuck you mean? Everybody ain't on my team. Still post on the blog like I'm y'all man. Chrome hard hat with the long sleeve. In the road truck, boys always a freeze. If I want a dead, I just pay that shit cheap. You one in the head, no LA paper key. Ain't peep your gang, shit weak. Can't running on me, I'm too slimy and neat. Hey, shout out to TP, he cooked up the beat. Got some tears in the hills, I need to try that with me. Really stood front line, real beef. But on the slide every day, couldn't eat shit. Sleeping up close on my technique. Gotta buy back the block cause I run concrete. Everybody around me see red. Everybody around me got one in the head. Shots pulled up, shooting, they fled. Shots pulled up, shooting, they was trying to fake dead. Fucked up, let me touch a little bread. Get too mad and I pay for some blood to be shed. Fuck your gang, you heard what I said. Before you cross me, I'ma sleep on the bunk bed. Drake up, I take the carbon instead. Too geeked up, I'm crossing all with the man. Free cup, he threw up on the lick, he was scared. He step on shit, be quiet, no said. Shoot first the motto, you know how we paid. Them hollow to hungry, they ate up his leg. I was just dropping shit, look where it led. Now I'm in the hills, I can't spell where we stayed. No, can't spell where we stayed. Brr. Big brr. Got up, wanna keep on start up.
Once again, I'm locked in with TP, we finna make a hit.
I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the band, sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the band, sticks and drums when we march up. Keep clutching my 5 stick, we checking niggas challenge, yo. You won't see me leave outside the house without my helmet. And my little niggas banging shots, the gang in Alabama. Hey, they let me squeeze a bust his cherry, clip hold a banana. Shit, I still can't wait to pull up on the block, Ryan found him. And I'm sliding like a sled in the snow, but I ain't sound her. My hoe know her head fast, she get to showing out for the camera. I beat it bad like Michael Jackson, think this my dirty Diana. Hey, how you let her snake up in the grass, sneak up in the house? So we get them bowls in, T to P gon' take them out. A key and Glock up on me now because I chose the paper route. You niggas better use a GPS and take the safer route. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the band, sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the band, sticks and drums when we march up. We with it today, we with it today. It's just me and baby Shiesty and we too deep in the race. Yeah, we with it today, we with it today. It's just me and baby Shiesty and we too deep in the race. Said the Draco came with side effects, I told her baby K. Who won't smoke with me, I pull up anytime at any day. This is not a 223, the chopper here shoot 308. Get that workout like a fitness room, you know we moving weight. Been feeling like my my birthday every day, wake up and get the cake. Hey, I was smoking out the P, weighing up ounces, smoking shake. No, I can't never let a nigga slide, I can't let him skate. Shots fired, he on Fox Live, bullet to your face. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at an early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the band, sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at an early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the band, sticks and drums when we march up. Big brr. Brr, brr.
We Japanese still. You getting cooked in front of your family? Like a Japanese meal. It's Yashoop the Hibachi, and none of you niggas can stop me, but can't help but watch me. We back, y'all. We back. I'm glad to be back. It's a whole another or different presentation to this. The scenery's different, as you guys can see. Yap Gang channel, Juice Shiesty in the building. To the right, you can see our new logo, Yap Gang Scholars. You understand? If anybody's watching that wants to contribute to our scholarship here, just donate to the book fund, as you can see on the banner. Yashubi 214 on Cash App. That's $ Yashubi with the I at the end, 214, YASHUBI 214. So we can continue to bring out these amazing narratives and books and literature so we can increase our knowledge on these said topics. With that being said, it's back to work here on the channel. This is a follow-up to my last video, Saneter Studios Misrepresents Ancient Egypt. So this is a part 2, and we're going to be dealing with the world of ancient Egypt, the same exact book, because this book is a treasure trove when it comes to ancient relics and the ancient history of ancient Egypt. And the reason why I want to do these videos is because a lot of people speak about the ancient world and speak about ancient Egypt, but they're not really representing ancient Egypt. What they're doing is forming a coalition, or a religion rather, that has romanticized ancient Egypt and has created their own quasi form or version of ancient Egypt, where there was no crime, they didn't do anything wrong, there was no slavery. According to these guys, every individual that was in ancient Egypt throughout millennia were black, according to these guys. There was no sexual deviancy going on, according to these guys. So, and then they say there was no. Some of these people go so far to say ancient Egypt didn't believe in gods. They were pretty much atheists, and when it mentions gods, it's talking about principles. So they go that far. So what I wanted to do was present a clean glass of water, a clear perspective from this guy with a PhD that wrote this book to you guys, so you guys can have some reference material outside of this small little circle known as the conscious community /BHI/ABO/ insert Afrocentric here. I want to give you guys a counter perspective. So, instead of this fringe idea that Jabari is selling, or Shaka Atmos or Saneter himself is selling to his audience. So with that being stated, let's get to the book, man. Welcome to the channel. Welcome to the channel. And be sure to subscribe to our newest channel, Yap Game Scholarship, which will be pinned on Genesis 49ers as well. The Yap Game Scholarship channel. You guys can check that out.
In this life, I earned it. No white man, no black man, no Jew man gonna stop me or block me or mock me. Just watch me. I came back like the Mach D, harder than government block cheese. Push button, no car keys. This art form is a part of me. This world so cold, my heart freeze. Unthaw me, Lord. Even when I didn't realize it, you still saw me, Lord. My prayers that the brotherhood can get on one accord. Cause we cannot afford anyone sowing seeds of discord.
So yeah, check that out right there, the Yap Gang Scholarship channel. Subscribe to that channel, support that channel. And again, if anybody wants to contribute to the scholarship, donate to the book fund, Cash App at Yashubi214. I don't live off the donations. I use those donations for what is said there, the book fund, for research purposes, so we can actually add to that collection. I've spent, my hard-earned money all these years getting these books on my own. If anything helps, anybody can contribute. It would be greatly appreciated. I love you guys. I love the guys that's in it for the information. I'm doing it for you guys specifically that want to actually learn instead of, placating to the coats. With that being said, let's get into the meat and potatoes here. We spent enough time, breaking things down and introducing a new channel, the Yap Gang Scholarship. And we will be uploading exclusive content on that channel. So make sure you subscribe to that. We're going to have interviews with geneticists on that channel. We're gonna be stepping up big time on that channel, and it will be PG-13. A lot of the content is clean, so go subscribe. There's plenty of work that needs to be done there, and we're going to achieve that. Again, we're about getting things done here. With that being stated, I said this enough. Let's go to the book. So this is the World of Ancient Egypt, a daily life encyclopedia. And again, this is written by, if I can pull it over there, go. This is written by Peter Lacovara, which is a PhD. Let me close some of these windows, it looks cluttered. So he is a PhD. So if I go here and type in Lacovara, you see that he's Dr. Peter Lacovara. He is the director of the Ancient Egyptian Archaeology and Heritage. So this guy is accredited, man. He went to Boston University, got his PhD in the Oriental Institute of University of Chicago. So this guy is well accredited. So if anybody was wondering where this book came from and why the price is very steep, that is why. So let's get back to what we're going to open up this video with. I believe it's page 1. I got it in my notes, y'all. Page 168. We're going to open up with marriage and deal with how the ancient Egyptians deal with marriage. I've been in this community for a while. So when I'm reading stuff like this, I just remember a lot of things that were brought up and said about ancient Egypt, which was not true. So marriage in ancient Egypt, right? It says once children reach adulthood, it was unusual to select a spouse, though there seems to have been no specifically set age. And I remember, the reason why I want to bring this up, I remember that being a big fuss about GMS, and Polite used it to his advantage to make the entire Israelite community look bad. The videos are still on YouTube. You guys can look this up. Polite, just type in Polite and GMS and it'll come up. So GMS was arguing that, you can get married to these young girls, these adolescent women, and everybody was like, that's pedophilia. But here's the problem. Ancient Egypt believed the same thing, where as soon as these boys were circumcised, as we're about to read, and some of these girls are getting married at 13, the difference is they were getting married to other people in their age bracket. They were not getting married to people that were like 50 or some shit, at least from what I've seen. So it was kind of hypocritical because one side was representing Egypt and one side was representing Israel, which again, Tahar and all those guys were misrepresenting Israel and saying, you can get married, y'all, if you were there, So that started a whole little insight. It incited a whole war on the internet, and GMS as bad as they are, pretty much their reputation spilled over on everyone else. So everybody had to it was on the Israelite side, had to pay for the crimes of these dilettantes. But at the same time, this practice was being practiced in ancient Egypt. So right here it says boys were circumcised sometimes in their early teens, and girls are often considered of marriageable age by 13 or shortly after the beginning of menstruation. There seems to be no specific marriage ceremony, but contracts were frequently written, and dowries were an expected part of the union. It was usual for the father of the bride to compensate her future husband. An example of dowry included in a marriage contract is the agreement between Apollonius and Thermion from the early Roman period, circa 30 BCE. Real quick, someone left in a comment in the last video stating that this book doesn't have dates. This book is replete with dates. What happens is you're just listening to me, and what happens, I don't always read what's in brackets to speed up me reading through the paragraph or the passage. But if you're actually looking at the screen, you can see dates all over the damn book. So I was like, you were just listening. You were not visually looking. Anyway, so here's a marriage contract here. It says from Thermion, let me blow this up. From Thermion, daughter of Apion, along with the guardian Apollonius, son of Charias, and from Apollonius, son of Ptolemaeus, Thermion and Apollonius, son of Ptolemaeus, agree that they have come together to share a common life. And the said Apollonius, son of Ptolemaeus, acknowledges that he has received from Thermion by hand from the house of dowry a pair of gold earrings weighing 3/4 in silver drachmae. And from now on, Apollonius, son of Ptolemaeus, shall provide Thermion as his wife all necessaries and clothing in proportion to his means, and shall not mistreat her, nor throw her out, not bring in another wife, or he shall directly forfeit the dowry, increased by half with right of execution upon both persons of the Apollonius, son of Ptolemaeus, and all his property as if by legal decision. So even back then in this ancient world, the marriage contract was to protect the woman, so she's not left without nothing, right? As we can see here, that this is drawn up to make sure that his daughter is being taken care of. They just bringing a woman in the house, right? And that lets you know that people that have multiple wives are wealthy people, because if you can survive without this dowry, that means you got some money. So it basically was protecting the rights of his daughter and making sure that everything runs smoothly in this marriage. It says here, like, even if he messes up or he infringes on this contract, that all his property will be taken from the father, and most likely given to the daughter so she can live off of, right? It says here, and Thermion shall fulfill her duties toward her husband in their common life, and shall not leave the house for a night or a day without consent of Apollonius, son of Ptolemaeus, nor dishonor nor injure their common home, nor consort with another man, or she, if guilty of any of these deeds, shall after trial forfeit the dowry. In addition, the guilty party shall be liable to the prescribed fine, 17 years Caesar for Monty. So this is a Roman era Egyptian marriage document, but as you can see, that these stipulations were put in place to protect both parties. It says these contracts usually stipulated how the husband would be responsible for feeding and clothing his wife and their children, and the right of the children to inherit his wealth. If the marriage ended in divorce, the wife was entitled to her dowry and up to 1/3 of the joint property accrued during the marriage, along with any other provisions for divorce written in the marriage contract. Excuse me. Marriages in ancient Egypt seem ideally to have been lifelong monogamous unions. However, there is evidence of a man having more than one partner. The word Hemet is translated as wife, without Hebswat connotes a concubine. Although there is some confusion about these terms, the Heknak letters quite specifically mention taking care that the mistress of the head of the household is not mistreated while he was away. So ancient Egyptians did believe and having wives and also having concubines, as we read in the last video. Let you know this is very a patriarchal society. And to the right, you can see the stele of Nenu from the first intermediate period. Intermarriage between different races and nationalities was unremarkable in ancient Egypt. This tomb stele depicts the Nubian soldier Nin and his Egyptian wife with their children at their feet. And as we brought out in the last episode, intermarriage was common in ancient Egypt. So for anyone claiming that ancient Egypt was like one or a monolith and they were all the same and they all looked the same, you're wrong. That's demonstrably false. Then it goes into the Stela Ninu. It said the Egyptians were free to marry non-Egyptians, and intermarriage was common in the border areas of the Delta and southern Upper Egypt. The Stela of Nenu, which probably came from the site of Gebelon, dates to the first intermediate period and depicts Nenu, a Nubian soldier, his wife, Sakat Hor, and their children and hunting dogs. It is a funerary stela which would have been set up in a tomb chapel at the burials of the family. It is inscribed with an offering formula, and a servant is shown offering Nenu a drink. Nubians were renowned archers and often served in the Egyptian army. Nenu is depicted as a Nubian with a darker skin tone and wearing traditional costume that included a wide leather sash and curly wig and holding a bow and quiver of arrows. His wife is positioned behind him and shown wearing the characteristic Egyptian sheath dress and long wig, and both wear Egyptian-style broad collars. The youngest child before them also wears a leather sash and a tufted hairstyle characteristic of Nubia. The rough stele is carved in a provincial style typical of the first intermediate period. Polygamy was common among the kings and some of the elite. There was one principal queen, the Hemet Neswat Warit, great royal wife, who supposed to bear the royal heir and could be a sister to further ensure the purity of the royal bloodline. If a king did not have a clear claim to the throne, marrying the daughter of the former ruler would cement his right to rule. Additional wives could be taken to cement relationships through diplomatic marriages with daughters of rulers of foreign countries or even with powerful local leaders. Brother-sister marriages or even relations between father and daughter could take place to help secure title to rule. So these royal families were practicing forms of incest to keep this going and keeping the kingship in their bloodline. As you can see, brother-sister marriage and even father-to-daughter interactions was going on in ancient Egypt. It says here, particularly if there was a stepson by a minor wife who needed to underscore his legitimacy by wedding a daughter of the king and his principal queen. Also, a non-royal could be legitimized by marrying the widow or daughter of a previous king. The tradition of brother, sister, or father-daughter marriages was mostly confined to the Egyptian ruling house and was not always practiced. In Egyptian mythology, marriage between brother and sister divinities and between fathers and daughters was a standard trope. While people have suggested this would cause severe abnormalities in their offspring, and it usually takes many generations of interbreeding to actually cause significant congenital defects. Marriage between cousins or uncles and nieces was found among the common people. Such unions were usually arranged and were often between people of the same social class. So, it's so funny reading this stuff because a lot of criticism goes on the ancient Bible, but you got to understand something. The Levantine peoples, which would include Israelites, they are culturally cousins to Egyptians. They're both Afro-Asiatic societies, right? So there are commonalities. And this marriage between cousins thing is a commonality between ancient Egypt and Levantine peoples. And again, marrying your cousin is not as lethal to, as part or prone to genetic disease as someone marrying a first degree relative, which is mother, father, brother, sister, right? So that it's pretty much the effects are negligible. But I've heard certain Afrocentrics try to throw dirt on the biblical tradition because it mentions the marriages of cousins, but this was the norm in ancient Egypt. And the reason why they do this because there's no one on their side sitting down every day trying to teach them the history of ancient Egypt. They get the quasi-microwave version of ancient Egypt and not what the real deal like you're getting today. So again, it says marriages between cousins or uncles and nieces was found among the common people. Such unions were usually arranged and were not most often between people of the same social class. And were most often between the people of the same social class. On the other hand, there seems to have been no obstacle as far as race or nationality went into marriage. So this concept of what is it called, misogyny or whatever you call it, where miscegenation did not exist in ancient Egypt. They believed that you can marry whoever you want to marry. Like, you can marry a Syrian, you can marry someone from the Levant, you can marry a Libyan, you can marry these people. And again, that flies in the face of you guys, you racial purists out here that believe that ancient Egypt across millennia remained the same color, or they all look Africoid, or they all look one way, and that's not true. It says it was not unusual for an Egyptian to marry a Nubian or even someone from another country, such as Syria or Libya. All right, so intermarriage was very common in ancient Egypt. All right, let me highlight that too. For all the racial purists out there and all the spiritual sons of Woodrow Wilson and Fletcher Cox and Plecker out there. So from there, I have on my notes, we dealt with marriage. So from there, let's deal with sexuality. What was the sexuality like of ancient Egypt? And that's on page 181. Let's go there. Sexuality. While there is little in the way of the explicit sexuality of Greco-Roman art and Egyptian art and literature, ancient Egyptian attitudes toward sexuality seem to have been more liberal than in the Judeo-Christian tradition. You have to keep that in mind. Sex was thought of as an essential element of everyday life, and even the gods themselves were thought to engage in sexual relations as an act of creation. In art, there are fairly straightforward depictions of nudity and sexual congress. However, the act of intercourse itself is usually represented in a highly stylized way, particularly in mythological or temple scenes, such as Isis in the form of a kite straddling Osiris to illustrate the impregnation that led to the birth of Horus, or the demure scene of the gods of Amun and Amen seated on a couch prior to their conceiving Hatshepsut, as depicted in her birth released at the Temple of Deir al-Bahri. It has been suggested that a similar scene in the tomb of the powerful 6th dynasty, official Meruka at Saqqara, where he sits with his wife on a bed, is similarly coded representation. On the other hand, there are graphic depictions of sex, most famously in the Turin erotic papyrus. The polychrome painted papyrus dates to the Ramesside era and graphically illustrates a number of sexual positions being engaged in both indoors and outside. The men are depicted on the papyrus as unattractive, balding, short, and punchy with exaggeratedly large genitalia, while the women are tall, young, and beautiful. At one end of the papyrus, a woman lies on the bed and reaches toward a man, and woman engaged in intercourse on the floor below her. Other scenes are more acrobatic in nature, including even an encounter on a chariot. In another scene, a man tries to stimulate a woman while she, in contrast, and her excrements, seemingly ignores him to apply her cosmetics. In the background are jars full of wine or beer, suggesting that it may be representing a party or even an orgy. Other interpretations are that it depicts a single man's encounters. The comment inscribed on the margins of the papyrus include, "Come behind me with your love and its agreeable work." The papyrus must have had a satirical purpose, for it also has a section of animals performing humorous tasks. Numerous erotic small sculptures and terracotta images were produced during the Greco-Roman period after about 300 BCE, often showing exaggerated large sex organs and multiple penetrations. Egyptian mythology featured sordid tales of sex, adultery, incest, and even necrophilia. The god Amun-Re began creation by masturbation, which produced his children. Shu and Tefnut, in their incestuous union, brought forth Nut and Geb. The offspring of these siblings, Isis, Nephthys, Asari, and Set, all had brother-sister relations. Seth killed his brother Osiris, but Isis was able to conceive a child with him even after death. Their son Horus engaged in an epic battle with Seth to avenge his father's murder. But another tale has Seth raping his nephew in an attempt to humiliate him. And the reason why that needs to be brought to the forefront there is because people are ignoring that and trying to explain that away, that Seth actually raped his nephew, actually raped Horus. And they were trying to say, oh, the sperm means poison. Okay, so sperm comes from a man's genitalia. Okay. Poison comes from a man's genitalia. Okay, that makes sense. No, it doesn't. You guys are just trying to explain away the elements that you do not like about ancient Egypt. But this is actually a theme that goes with the Seth and Horus encounters. It says here, while there seem to have been no prescriptions against premarital intercourse, after marriage, adultery was considered an offense. In the tale of the two brothers, the adulterous wife was found out and murdered, and her body was thrown to the dogs. Homosexual relations were not forbidden, but there's little evidence for them. And as in the tale of Horus and Seth, or of Pepi and the general Saneter, it seems to have been considered somewhat shameful. It appears that some religious festivals may have included orgiastic celebrations. Many foods were considered aphrodisiacs, such as lettuce, which were associated with the fertility god Men, who was depicted with an erect penis. Onions, fennel, ginger, pomegranates, coriander, and radishes mixed together were also thought to have aphrodisiac properties. The tomb of the two brothers. One of the most unusual and discussed tombs found in Egypt is the mastaba of Nainkum and Kum-Hotep, which dates to the mid-5th dynasty. It was later buried by the causeway of the pyramid of King Unas at Saqqara. Being buried as soon after its construction preserved much of the painted detail of the tomb. And it is considered one of the most beautiful tombs in the entire necropolis, as well as one of the largest. The tomb is unique in having been built for two men, Nainkum and Kum-Hotep, who shared the same titles, which included Prophet of Ra and the Sun Temple of Niosere, and heads of the manicurists of the Great House. Even more remarkable are many scenes that show the men together in intimate embrace. Although some have suggested that they were brothers and possibly twins, one scholar even suggested they were conjoined twins. The men, in fact, had different parents. There has been much speculation as to their relationship. They may have been homosexual companions, although there are also depictions of their wives and children within the tomb. So there's a whole debate on this tomb of the two brothers. Were they engaging in homosexual acts? We will never truly know, but it seems that the images are depicting that. But these men did have wives and children, so that would mean that, at the minimum, they will be quote unquote bisexual. Anyway, I think we read social structure last time. Let me check my notes. We'll move on from this. So we learned about marriage and sexuality. Let's go from wives to husbands. Let's go to wives and husbands. We read social structure. We know the Pharaoh pretty much had absolute fucking power over ancient Egypt. And he was top of the social ladder. The majority of ancient Egypt were like peasants, like semi-free peasants. So if you wasn't a part of that 1%, which included the priesthood, certain wealthy individuals that were up there as nomarchs, you were struggling in ancient Egypt. And you had very little to survive on. And majority of the Egyptian populace are illiterate. Again, education was reserved for the elite, not the commoner. So let's deal with the wives and husbands, right? It says, as soon as a young man reached mid-adolescence, it was time for him to start his own family. Women were believed to be suitable for brides after their first menses, as we read earlier. The average man, when they first married, was around 16 to 20 years, though some males were much older. Most marriages in ancient Egypt were probably arranged and occurred within small communities of families that were closely linked. Census records from the Roman period after about 30 BCE record that a large percentage of individuals were first cousins or step or even full siblings. Some of the wisdom literature from the late period 664 to 343 BCE gives advice to parents on selecting a husband for their daughter. Despite the prevalence of arranged marriages, the love poetry that survives clearly indicates a notion of romantic attraction. One example reads, "Your hand is my hand, my body trembles with joy, and my heart is exalted because we walk together. And she is more beautiful than any other girl. She is like a star rising, with beautiful eyes for looking and sweet lips for kissing." Prenuptial agreements could be drawn up by the bride's father and potential son-in-law to protect the bride should the union fail. Virginity does not seem to have been a necessity for marriage, and premarital sex was socially acceptable. However, once a couple married, they were expected to be faithful to each other. In small, watchful communities, it would be difficult to keep such illicit liaisons secret, and one papyrus records the anger of the populace at an adulterer as follows: "Your people, their elders and children, men and women, have gone in the evening, and they have come, saying, we have come in order to beat them up together with their people. It was the steward of the house who said to them, oh, what is this then about? And they answered him with these words, it is 8 months to this day that he has had sexual intercourse with this woman, although he is not her husband." So the whole community will beat you up and want to put hands on you if you committed adultery. It says here, not every marriage was arranged by the family, and partners were not always drawn from relatives or the local pool of neighbors, for even marriages between Egyptians and foreigners occurred, as we touched on earlier. While kings could have multiple wives, including foreign princesses, sent to cement diplomatic ties, it was not common, although not unheard of, for non-royal men to have more than one wife. These women would have been more like concubines or mistresses and would not have had the same status as the wife, as the Hanak letters indicate. The words used for concubine was HBSWT, as opposed to the word for wife, which was Hemet. The term for husband was he or hi. The principal queen was known as the Great Royal Wife. In large private houses, just as in royal palaces, there was quarters devoted purely to the women. This would include wives, daughters, other female relations, and concubines. The ancient Egyptian term for these quarters were epet or per kimret, private rooms, or harem. These were often suites of rooms set in the inner part of the house besides the master's bedroom. For royalty, they could be entire separate palace communities like Gurab. Such segregated living quarters existed in the Middle East until relatively recent times. Again, this is very common to have separate living quarters for the women, as we just read. Ancient Egypt and the Levant are very alike in that regard. Okay, so from there, let's read. So we dealt with marriage, sexuality, and wives and husbands. You know what? Let's deal with the harems, since we just read that. And then we'll go into the royal administration. I'll educate you guys on that real quick. It's not going to take too long. I don't have the harems in my notes, so I got to search for it for a minute. No, it's in here. House and home, Memphis mining, priestly communities, sanitation, deeds, towns and cities. Where Royal Harem, there it is. Oh, it's right after Royal Administration, so we're going to go there after this. The Royal Harem. You know what? Let me just read this all together. Let's go to Royal Administration, then we'll go to the Royal Harem right afterward. It says right here, because the king was the nexus of all branches of government, the civil bureaucracy, the military, and the religious establishment, much of his authority was delegated to those around him to oversee the daily aspects of governance and involve the pharaoh when necessary. So again, the king is like an absolute power here. He has control of all branches of the government, like you see in DPR North Korea, the Kim family. They oversee every damn thing. They oversee the National Workers' Party, the judicial branch. Everything is overseen by them. Same thing in ancient Egypt. You know, the king was an absolute power, pretty much a dictator. The king was also surrounded by a royal household, which included his children, wives, and other relations, many of whom took part in the running of the country to a greater or lesser extent. When a king came to the throne as a child, he was often under the care of a regent or other court officials. When Hatshepsut was appointed regent for the young Thutmose III, she gained a taste of power and eventually took on all the trappings of a true king, even dressing and referring to herself as a man. Women did come to the throne under rare circumstances. However, Hatshepsut's grab at power was not regarded as legitimate by her successors. So this is what needs to be known, because Umar and all these other pundits on Saneter will say that ancient Egypt was a matriarch and it was ruled by women, and it's not true. This is very rare. I think only 5 of the rulers throughout the whole pharaonic dynasty was actually a woman. And as we read in the last episode, that they became regent or sole regent because the husband died and the male heir was too young to rule himself. That's how they were able to acquire that power. It's not because that they had a natural system that allowed women to become rulers or regents over Egypt. That is not the case at all. Again, ancient Egypt is patriarchal. Ancient Egypt is androcentric. Most of the wealth and power is in the hands of men, not women. And as we read in the last chapter, we read the last episode, the women's occupation mainly concerned the chores of the house and rearing children. As the old adage goes, barefoot and pregnant, right? Which is nothing wrong with that. That's natural for a woman to take care of her children and take care and order her house. But Afrocentrics have demonized that position for some reason. And they're trying to make ancient Egypt fit their modern concept and ideology. Again, you don't start seeing women rise above whatever this barefoot and pregnant status until America. That's really an advent of America, not ancient Egypt. The royal harem was sometimes a hotbed of conspiracies that could lead to plots against the ruler himself. In some cases, the king made his son or chosen successor a co-ruler to ensure a smooth transition of power and to head off any possible contenders. If a candidate was a non-royal or the son of a lesser wife, he would often wed the daughter of the great royal wife to bolster his legitimacy. Such unions between half-siblings were not standard, but they did happen. Foreign rulers sent their daughters as brides in diplomatic marriages, although the Egyptians never reciprocated. The many children from the king's multiple wives often filled a great many administrative posts in all the branches of government. The principal portfolios of the civil administration concerned the royal treasury, the Department of Agriculture, the Ministry of Works, the judiciary, and the army. These were all under the eye of the vizier, who was the chief advisor and administrator of the king, and in the Old Kingdom, often a close relative. The vizier also held religious office of the high priest of Heliopolis. Up until the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, there was a single vizier, but after the position was split into one for the Lower Egypt and one for Upper Egypt, the vizier oversaw the provincial administrators, including the nomarchs or provincial governors, who were sometimes referred to as prince, count, or mayor. Under them were local officials who, like the nomarchs, often inherited their posts. They were responsible for collecting the taxes, making sure irrigation canals were unobstructed, and putting down civil unrest, among other duties. Other officials of the royal administration included the keepers of the royal seal, who wielded great power. He held the authority to issue decree in the king's name. Now, real quick, I want to give commentary here. Because again, a lot of these seats of position and power and authority were bloodline related, meaning you have to descend from someone that had that position and transfer it. And normally it's transmitted from father to son, as we read in the last episode. These positions are transmitted from father to son, showing you that ancient Egypt was very much so androcentric and patriarchal. Many of these positions of power were held by men. If you show something outside of that, that's the exception to the rule, not the rule itself, as we just seen. Which just also shows you that majority of the populace were not in these positions of wealth or positions of power. Majority of the populace in ancient Egypt were indeed semi-free peasants, right? Subject to corvée labor, as we read in the last episode. The king could say, listen, I want the Great Pyramid of Khufu built. You take 10,000 of these people that live in this city and you make them do it. That's what was going on. This is why Egypt did not need a huge slave labor force, because they could just make their own people do it, like the DPR North Korea does today. When they get building projects, the government benefits from it. The people don't. They send the people to Africa to build monuments. They send the people to Siberia to build bridges and stuff like that. The people don't benefit at all. The government does. Likewise in ancient Egypt. It says here, another important official was the overseer of the treasury, the Emiraper Hedge. Sorry, I can't pronounce. I don't know how to read these words. It says here, the state treasury received foreign tributes as well as taxes, looked after the royal estates, sent out trading expeditions, and was responsible for disbursements of officials and craftsmen working on state projects, donations to temples, and funding for military and mining campaigns. Some of these men could also hold the title overseer of the granaries, which gave them control of the wealth of the state collected in agricultural taxes. Tax revenues, usually in the form of a share of the grain crop, eventually wound up in the royal treasury, which was also under the jurisdiction of the vizier, as was the bearer of the royal seal. An official responsible for the management of goods and messages coming into and going out of the royal court. There was also the panoply of courtiers with a wide variety of titles, including the sole friend of the king, which ironically was given to many people. Individuals also collected long lists of titles, which they proudly displayed on their funerary monuments. Often these appellations were purely nominal, and others remained obscure. There were also a rather blurred line between civil, administrative, and judicial duties of the vizier and those of the local councils, the kinbet, which also seemed to have administrative and judicial functions. Although strictly codified and hierarchical, there were mechanisms of redress, as is shown in the tale of the eloquent peasant. Many officials had their positions for a lifetime, and they were often passed down from father to son, which helped ensure stability in the government. As we just read, right? More patriarchal mechanisms and concepts in ancient Egypt. Royal harem. While the term harem conjures up Orientalist fantasies for some, it was in fact an institution well documented in ancient Egypt. In large private houses, just as in the royal palaces, there were quarters devoted purely to women, including wives, daughters, other female relations, and concubines. The ancient Egyptian term for these quarters were epet or per kimret, translated as private rooms or harem. Such segregated living quarters and concubines, but wealthy Egyptians also could have concubines, as they indicated in the Heknok letters. Such women did not hold the same status as the principal wife, but their circumstances and probability varied from household to household. Unlike the situation in the Ottoman period, not all women and children were necessarily gathered at a single location, nor were they cut off from public life. However, separate quarters for women within the place are known, as well as structures adjacent to the palace for the royal women or even independent institutions altogether. The royal harem was not only for the court of the royal women, but also served as a place for upbringing and education of the royal children and for children of the elite and of foreign rulers. It is probable that the only principal wife and her children, perhaps only with the king's mother, resided in the palace proper with the ruler, and that the majority of the secondary wives and their entourages would have been quartered in the harem palaces scattered throughout the land. Such places were also probably the residences of the foreign wives and their retinues that were sent in diplomatic marriages to the Egyptian court. These royal foreign wives could receive delegations from their home countries, and that fulfilled the role of the diplomatic missions to the Egyptian court. Other women attached to the palace engaged in musical performances for the court, as well as providing supplies and provisions for the royal family. And the retainers of these women may have also been quartered in the harem. In particular, the production of textiles were undertaken by the women of the harem. This was certainly in the case of the harem palace of Gurab and the Fayum. It comprised twin long parallel building complexes within an enclosure wall along the magazines and a small temple. A representation of the royal harem in the tomb of Neferhotep at Thebes fits well with the ground plan. In addition to the palace at Gurab, a larger community with houses and pottery production facilities was situated outside the enclosure. Women quarters are also depicted in the tombs of Amarna, where they are shown as being situated inside the residential palace. Though there is some debate as to where they could be identified in the ground plans of the surviving parts of the palace of Amarna. At the palace of Amenhotep III, he ruled 1390 to 1352 BCE at Malkata, a group of harem suites are grouped along either side in a long central hall leading to the throne dais of the kingdom. These small suites, very similar to a depiction in the tomb of A at Amarna, consisted of a reception room with a throne platform, a bath, a bedroom, and stone chambers were all brightly painted and may have been temporary quarters for royal women in their households, who may have been actually residents within another structure called the North Palace located nearby. Similar quarters also are associated with the Temple Palace in the New Kingdom, where they would serve as an otherworldly residence for the king and his court. While the royal harems may not have been the flesh pots of some writers' imaginations, they were on occasion a hotbed of intrigue, as revealed by the famous harem conspiracy. So again, we can see that these were used to separate these women and put them in their own living quarters and whatnot. Many of you Afrocentrics would be upset at that. If someone made you do that, you would be upset. If you had to be quartered off in your own living situation, away from everybody else, away from the men or whatnot, you'd be upset. But wait, why can't I just go in the palace? Why? Because we grew up in this American system, and America has pretty much created co-ed and giving women these high rights that did not exist in the ancient world. But for some reason, Afrocentrics and these people in Saneter are trying to present the information as if ancient Egypt is the bastion for women's rights, and it's not. Or equality at the least, right? So let's go to the temple administration. And then from there, we're going to deal with religion. We're going to flesh out the religion of ancient Egypt. Oh, well, before we go to religion, I want to deal with the word Pharaoh, because there's another misconception that these Saneter pundits like to do is say that, well, they used to do this, say that the word Pharaoh is a Greek word, and that is not true. It is not of Greek orientation. Anyway, temple administration. As the chief priest in ancient Egypt, the Pharaoh was the ultimate authority over the temples. However, temple administration was not organized into a hierarchical tree as was the civil administration. Each temple was its own separate realm. The office of the chief prophet could oversee a series of local temples, particularly if the holder was of high enough status, such as the high priest of Amun at Karnak. Some high-ranking prophets could even be dispatched by the king to intervene in various temples throughout the land, such as an office could be given to the most important officials, such as the viceroy of Nubia. Some individuals in the civil administration also had priestly office, and in fact, many Egyptians were employed as part-time temple priests. Since the priests were provided with food and other necessaries from the temple stores while serving in the temples, it was a desirable position. So they had part-time priests in Egypt as well. Part-time. They went there, did their thing, went back to their normal lives. And as we just read, it was very desirable because you could fucking eat. You know, again, remember, as we read in the last episode, many of the populace of ancient Egypt, majority of the people were only given a little bit to survive off of. Right? So if they could get into one of these part-time priest positions, that was gold to them, because at least you can satiate yourself, right? You can like feed yourself. It says here the larger temples were self-sufficient communities with production facilities for every possible good and service. They maintained fleets of ships and far-flung estates that provided food and raw materials even from foreign lands, such as the cedar wood that Winnemoon was sent to fetch in the report of Winnemoon. Temples were usually the center of economic activity for most communities and were the main agents of redistribution throughout the land as food and money flowed into them and then were parceled out in payment to temple staff. However, it's not until the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, that we see professional class of full-time priests. Even still, much of the temple personnel were citizens with other jobs who worked in shifts on rotation. Often their duties were related to the work these men and women did in their secular life, such as sculptors, physicians, barbers, and the like. So these people would be called part-time priests, but the works that they were doing were sculpting, physicians, barbers, and the like, whatever. And as we read earlier, like the priestess would be the singers and the chantresses, right? So when you put this into perspective and stop being vague, when you call someone a priest, what are you actually saying? What does that denote, right? And Jabari will not tell you this. Someone can be a part-time priest and be a damn sculptor or be a barber. He's in there shaving people, right? But if you listen to Jabari, that means that they were high priests or something like that, and they did all the rites and rituals. That is not true. That is not true, and that's why I keep telling y'all, man, don't spit the breeze about it. Read about it. All right? All right, let's keep reading. For those with ritual functions, there were levels of rank starting with the Wat priests, who served a variety of low-level functions. Next was the Hemnetcher, the servants of God, who were allowed greater access to the temple. And if you listen to Jabari and the pundits of Saneter, they would think everybody was that. No, everybody was not the Hemnetcher. It says, in carrying out the daily temple liturgy, the Wat priests and the Hemnetcher operated in different aspects of the rites. The most important differences in function between the two was the Hemnetcher was able to enter the inner sanctums of the temple of the realms of the God, while the Wat priests conducted most other duties outside of the sanctuary. Other classes of priests had more specific duties, such as the lector priests, who not only read the text of the rituals, but also acted as choir masters. Priests of a high rank accumulated a number of titles or even held offices in different temples. The chief priests of the temple were the high priests, the Hemnetcher Tepi, or the first servant of the god. Sim priests officiate the funeral rites. Proper performances of such rites was usually the responsibility of the eldest son of the deceased. Again, more patriarchal themes here. It's going off the son. And a lot of these positions are transmitted through what? The father to son. In the case of the king, it will be his chosen successor to perform these rituals. While some positions were passed on the father to son, some priests, especially high-ranking ones, could be appointed by the pharaoh, often from the officials of the court or even from among the royal princes. Temples also had schools because the ability to read and write was essential for the priesthood. Some also needed a knowledge of geometry, arithmetic, astronomy, and astrology. The king was able to reprimand and even remove priests from office. They could also be ordered to provide supplies or labor for the crown. That goes with the corvée labor. Ordered, meaning the government is telling you you have to do it, right? You have to provide labor. You have to help build this monument. You have to help erect this obelisk. You have to help. You have to do it. It's conscription. It's compulsory service. It's not voluntary, right? And as we just read, again, more androcentric patriarchal themes coming from ancient Egypt. It is not a matriarch. It's not ruled by women. It's not determined, again, as we read in the first episode, majority of the power and wealth was in the hands of men in ancient Egypt. Same in the temple administration. So when they tell you women were priests, ask them to define that. Right? Rewind that so we can define that, man. Expound on it. You can tell that people are not really studying this stuff when you ask them to explicate it. Right? They can't expound on it. As we just read, these high priests of ancient Egypt, they pretty much were men. But if you listen to Jabari, he's going to have you thinking that, no, that's not the case. The women would do the other, primarily the other jobs, which was chantresses and singing was most of it. And there's nothing wrong with that. But it's it's vastly different from the narrative that you are selling on Saneter Studio. It says here, The royal administration could also order one temple to divert its resources to another temple whose influence it wished to expand, or commander resources from temples to pharaohs long forgotten. The great wealth that flowed into the temples, particularly in the New Kingdom, was astounding. And one reason given for Akhenaten's 1353 to 1336 BCE religious reforms was to block the growing power of the Amun's priesthood. His new religion failed, and by the 21st dynasty, 1070 to 945 BCE, the high priests of Amun had grown powerful enough to declare themselves kings. All right, so from there, I think we did all the other portions. We did wives and husbands, sexuality. We dealt with marriage, and we just finished the royal administration. Let's deal with the Pharaoh, and then we're going to move on to religion. So page 370, we're going to backtrack a little bit. Deal with the term Pharaoh, because these pundits on Saneter have stated that the word Pharaoh was Greek, of Greek orientation, and it's not true. So let's get into it. Pharaoh. The concept of divine kingship dates back to the earliest beginnings of the dynastic Egypt and the rulers of Abydos who founded the state. Indeed, the tomb of King Djur, 3016 to 2970 BCE, of the first dynasty was even transformed into the tomb of the god Osiris, the mythical first king of Egypt. So again, this is more proof that these people believed in gods. They believe in divinity. They believe that these gods were real, and they played a role in their society and played a role on earth, whether it be creation or co-regency. As we're reading now, they believe that the king himself is like a manifestation of God, you know. So even here it says, even earlier, the living king was associated with the falcon god Horus, an image of the raptor topped with the Serek, a rectangular frame supported by the paneling palace facade, which contained the royal name. Other royal names that comprise the king's titulary included the Nepti name, which was preceded by images of a vulture and cobra symbolizing Upper and Lower Egypt. A third name was the Golden Horse name, written above the hieroglyphic symbols for gold. The most familiar names are the prenomen or throne name and the nomen or birth name. The prenomen is also known as the Lord of the Two Lands name and is introduced by the hieroglyphic signs of the sedge and beast signifying Upper and Lower Egypt. It was bestowed at the king's accession to the throne and was the principal name he was known by. The nomen is usually preceded by the title Sa-Re, sons of Re. This was the name given at birth. So Saneter's name would be the sons of Neter, or sons of gods, or whatever. That's what Saneter would mean. Sa-Re means sons of Re, so Saneter must mean sons of the Neter, or sons of the gods. So this was the name given at birth, although sometimes upon the king's ascension, another epithet will be added to it. The prenomen and the nomen are written in cartouches. These derive from the hieroglyphic sign Shin, a coiled rope symbolizing universal power. To some of the French in the late 18th century, the shape of the Shin reminded them of the gun cartridge or cartouche. Although often only the prenomen and nomen were used, all five names made up the king's official title. For example, the full title of Thutmose III, 1479 to 1425 BCE, was as follows: Horus, mighty bull, arising in Thebes, he of the two ladies, enduring in kingship, like Re in heaven, Horus of gold, powerful of strength, sacred of appearance, he the sage in the bee, enduring of the form as Re, son of Re, Thutmose, beautiful of forms. The term pharaoh derives from the royal palace, the pra or pra, and gradually became conflated with its most prestigious resident. So this is where the term pharaoh comes from. It does not come from the Greek language. It does not come from the Greeks, the Greco-Roman era. It's actually much older than that. It says here, the first example of the pra was used specifically to address the ruler in the papyrus letter from Gurab written to Akhenaten. Its use became more common over time, and in some Ptolemaic and Roman temples, the cartouches decorate the walls are just inscribed Pharaoh. Although there are some ancient kings lists, there are few and not always complete. Some kings were deliberately left out, such as the heretical or monarch kings, and some were forgotten. The division of the Egypt's rulers of Egypt's rulers into dynasties was done by a priest named Manetho, right in the Ptolemaic period, 304 to 30 BCE. The dynastic divisions do not always correctly reflect either the relationship or the order of the pharaohs. As we learn more, Egyptian history is largely a genealogy that is constantly being revised and rewritten. The standard order of royal successions would be that the kingship would pass from father to son as it did from Osiris to Horus. Ideally, it was the son of the great royal wife, the principal queen. However, there were often complications and intrigues that would cause deviation from the norm. In some cases, a queen could be made regent or even attain full power under extraordinary circumstances. Even commoners could take the throne in the absence of a royal heir, as in the case of Ay, ruling 1327 1323 BCE. Horemneb, he ruled 1323 to 1295 BCE, and Pyramesu, Ramesses I, he ruled 1295 to 1294 BCE. Menes, the first pharaoh. According to ancient Egyptian history, Menes was the founder of the unified Egypt and the first king of the first dynasty. The name recorded in Manetho's list of the dynasties and their rulers were likely the Egyptian name Mene, found in the earlier Abydos and Turin kings list. His claim to fame is not only that he was the first king to rule and unite Egypt, at least the human king, since Osiris is credited in the myth with being the first ruler, but he is also known for the foundation of Memphis. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, 1st century BC, records that Menes was the first lawgiver and founder of the cults of the Egyptian gods. He is also celebrated by the Roman historian Pliny the Elder as the inventor of writing, which is associated with the first dynasty. Even more extraordinary is the tale that the king was attacked by his own dogs while hunting in the marshes, but was able to escape on the back of a crocodile and later founded the city Crocodiliopis to commemorate his salvation. He is also said to have met his end by being carried off by a hippopotamus. Egyptologists have postulated that Menes must have been one of the other names of one of the known kings of the first dynasty. Originally, he was associated with Narmer, who is commemorated as uniting the two lands on the famous palette from Herculopolis. However, textual information suggests that it was not Narmer, but his son, Aha, who should be identified as Menes. Fragments of clay-drawn seals found in Abydos in the royal tombs there show Narmer's name alternating with the name Men, suggesting that he was probably the successor to Narmer. There are also labels that compound the name of Aha with that of Men. All right, so from there, so now we know that Pharaoh is not a damn Greek term, as some of the pundits of Saneter have claimed. Let's go to religion, and we're gonna spend a lot of time there. That's page 417. We're gonna end the video on that because, as I stated in the last episode, many of these ancient these Afrocentrics claim that ancient Egypt had no religion; it was pretty much atheistic. So we're gonna deal with that and conclude and keep this episode under 2 hours to make it rewatchable, so you guys can rewatch this. Religion and beliefs. Introduction. The ancient Egyptians believed in a myriad of myths and gods created to explain the world around them. Central to the Egyptian belief was the myth of Osiris, the god of the dead. Osiris of Abydos was believed to be the first king, and his supposed burial place became an important pilgrimage destination. He was murdered by his jealous brother, Seth, who chopped his body into pieces and scattered them over the earth. The bits were gathered up by Osiris' wife, Isis, who magically restored his body so that he could conceive a son. Horus, who would avenge his father's death in an epic battle with his uncle. During the battle, Horus had one of his eyes poked out, then restored, and thus became a magical healing symbol. According to the myths, Horus's eye became animated and started flying around. It was transformed into a living entity on its own and was not just an eye restored. So again, the ancient Egyptians believed in this story. They venerated this story. You know, they believed in these gods. They thought they were real beings that actually did this, right? But if you listen to the pundits of Saneter Studios, they'll have you believe that this is all metaphor for a principle, or this is them explaining chemical science or something like that. And that's not true at all. That's modern confabulation by Afrocentrics. Says here, the Egyptians believed that when you died, you became a manifestation of Osiris, a god in your own right. They saw the life in the next world as much like life in this one. They endeavored to ensure that their bodies would be preserved and that they would be supplied with everything they could possibly need, including food and drink, clothing, cosmetics, jewelry, furniture, toys, and games. While the tombs they were buried in were sealed, they had above ground memorial chapels that people were encouraged to visit. Even after death, the Egyptians hoped to participate and be remembered in the world of the living. They believed that to see a person's face and to utter his or her name made the person live again. The Egyptians believed that after you die, your spirit went through a perilous journey through the underworld and into the hall of judgment, where Osiris sat on his throne. The heart of the deceased will be weighed against the feather of truth, and if it was found to be heavy with sin and threw off the scales, then the monster Ammon, part crocodile, part lion, part hippopotamus, devoured the spirit. The deceased was given a heart scarab that protected his owner against any damning revelations. Once the test was passed, the deceased was welcomed into the next world, which was much like the one he or she had left behind. The gods were also manifested on earth in their temples, which were home to the divine image and conceived as a mirror of the cosmos. The rites and rituals the gods presided over helped organize the people's calendar, and the gods acted as agents of redistribution that kept the economy going. Egyptian religious beliefs profoundly affected the cultures around them and even ultimately our own. The Amarna heresy. First of all, I want to say, how do you read all this and not come to a conclusion? How do you come to a conclusion that they don't believe in gods, or that they were atheists, or that that gods meant principle? I don't know how you read this. You have to be a real remix doctor. You know, you have to really be Dupree in his prime, man, when he was remixing everything, right? Amarna heresy. The Amarna heresy was the most fundamental change in religious practice that Egypt would see until the advent to Christianity. The exact motivation for this dramatic change in Egyptian theology is much debated. What we do know is that that during the late 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1295 BCE, an obscure deity, the Aten, an aspect of the sun, God Re, in the form of a solar disk, was elevated to become the sole deity in the world's first monotheistic religion. Already in the reigns of Thutmose IV and Amenhotep III, the Aten was being resurrected as a member of the pantheon of the royal patronage. However, with the ascension to the throne of Amenhotep IV, the official religion began to be altered, with the Aten eventually heralded as Egypt's sole god, amalgamating in the Aten the forms of other solar deities. By the 5th year of his reign, Amenhotep IV's religious revolution began to take shape. He ordered the construction of a new capital, Akhenaten, the horizon of Aten, in the Middle Kingdom at the place known today as Tel Amarna. He proclaimed his new city on the boundary stele set up in the cliffs around the site to mark the perimeter of his new city. He also officially changed his name to Akhenaten, agreeable to the Aten. In the moving of the court from the traditional ceremonial centers of Thebes and Memphis, Akhenaten created a showplace for his new religion, free from the monuments and acolytes of the past. Akhenaten summed up his beliefs in the famous hymn to Aten. The great living Aten, who is in Jubilee, the Lord of all that the disk encircles, Lord of the sky, Lord of the earth, Lord of the house of Aten and Aten, and the king of the upper and lower Egypt, who lives by Maat, the Lord of the two lands, Neferkipuri, sole one of Re, son of Re, who lives by Maat, the Lord of crowns, Akhenaten, great in his lifetime, and his beloved great queen, the lady of the two lands, Neferneferu, Aten, Nefertiti, who lives in health and youth forever. Earth brightens when you're dawn in a light land, when you shine as Aten of daytime, as you dispel the dark, as you cast your rays, the two lands are in festivity. Awake, they stand on their feet, you have roused them. bodies cleansed, clothed. Their arms adore your appearance. The entire land sets out to work. All beasts browse on their herbs, trees, herbs, and sprouting. Birds fly from their nests, their wings greeting your ka. How many are your deeds, though hidden from sight, O sole God, because besides whom there is none? You made the earth as you wish, you alone, all peoples, herds, flocks, all upon earth that walk on legs, all on high that fly on wings, the lands of Kor and Cush, the land of Egypt. You set every man in his place. You supply their needs. Everyone has his food. His lifetime is counted. Their tongues differ in speech. Their characters likewise. Their skins are distinct. For you distinguish the peoples. That's a long quote by him. But as you can see, he was trying to bring Egypt into a monotheistic mode where everyone would worship Aten instead of being polytheistic where everybody had their gods. Even you had local gods, you had national gods, as we read in the last episode. Akhenaten built other temples to Aten, notably at the most important cultic centers of Karnak and Heliopolis. Even more provocatively, he closed down the temples to the other gods and began an iconoclastic campaign against the old supreme god, Amun. He ordered the defacing of Amun's images and even his name in shrines and temples. And another radical departure, Akhenaten's new religion was anachronic, at least in terms of what the Egyptians were used to. The Aten is depicted as a solar disk, its rays terminating in the hands that sometimes give the Ankh, a symbol of life. There were no statues or three-dimensional images of Aten, and the new temples that were constructed for Aten were designed as vast open courts to let the sunlight in, rather than traditional massive temples with their darker inner sanctums. Because they had to be built in a hurry to replace the temples of the old gods, the Aten temples were built out of small blocks called talatat, measuring 1 cubit long by half a cubit high, or 10.5 inches, or by 21.25 inches. The scene on them depicting the royal family worshiping the Aten in the daily life of the palace provides a wealth of information on the cult and the city. Even the style of the reliefs and sculptures created for all of this construction was a radical departure from tradition. They were done in free and mannerist style that ranged from exquisite naturalism to almost grotesque caricatures, and as a stela of the chief sculptor's records at the command of the king himself. Atenism has been seen as the world's first example of monotheism. However, Akhenaten and his family were the exclusive intermediaries between the god and the people. Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti were the ones representing worshiping the Aten and were the focus of much of the ritual veneration that took place. There does not seem to have been a way an individual could approach the god. Akhenaten's religious information did not live beyond him and his penultimate successor, his son Tutankhaten, who changed his name to Tutankhamun in 1336 to 1327 BCE, reinstated the old religion and moved the court back to Thebes. Akhenaten's statues were smashed and his temple was dismantled. His name and reign were erased from the official records, only to be rediscovered by archaeologists millennia later. The reason for such a radical departure from an age-old tradition have been widely speculated on, and Akhenaten had been cast as everything from an idealistic dreamer or a Stalinist demagogue. Moving on to animal mummies, as we can see that this is clearly a faith-based, religion-based society. Ancient Egypt was very much so religious, right? Their religiosity preceded everything, even their kingship, right? So when you go to Saneter and they start spouting these lies about they didn't believe in gods, they believe in principles, just tell them the source up. Where are you getting this from? Anyway, animal mummies. Even more proof that these people were very religious. Watch this. Many species of animals were mummified in the later periods of the ancient Egyptian history. These were not pets, but sacred animals that were often raised in temple precincts with the specific purpose of being sacrificed. The animals were killed and mummified, some almost as elaborately as humans, and then offered in the temples and at sacred sites by pious pilgrims, much like the bronze votives that were also deposited by thousands from the Third Intermediate Period, 1070 to 653 BCE. Onward, after a sufficient number of mummies had been collected in the temple, they were then buried by the priests within the temple grounds or in sacred animal cemeteries. A wide variety of creatures were so treated, including cats, dogs, ibises, falcons, and even fishes, snakes, and shrews, among others. Because many Egyptian gods had animal mummies, it was thought that the offering one of their mascots would gain the person giving it special favor from the god. It has also been suggested that the Egyptians believed the animal souls would serve as messengers to the gods. While they are sometimes said to have been a cheaper substitute for the bronze statues offered in the temples, some animal mummies were interred in bronze coffins, some quite elaborate with gold and silver inlay. Others were deposited in wooden coffins, pottery jars, or just wrapped in linen. The wrappings also vary in quality from very plain bandages to intricately woven ones with appliques. It actually became quite an industry with millions of mummified animals being offered in places throughout the country. As the demand for animal mummies grew, the mummification techniques became more careless. CT scans and X-ray studies have revealed that many animal mummies to be fake, perhaps as many as 1/3 under the wrappings, which replicate the shape of a particular animal, where only some bones or feathers, wood, sticks, rocks, or pieces of pottery. Still, some animals were very carefully prepared, and expensive materials such as imported oils, beeswax, vitamin, and coniferous resins were used in preparing them. One of the earliest, and to the left, you can see an example of this mummy. One of the earliest and most important animal mummy coats was of the sacred Apis bull. The Apis bull was actually a divine being in itself and was worshipped as a god. A bull with special markings would be chosen and then housed in its own temple at Memphis, where it was consulted as an oracle. And so people consulting these animals for advice or whatnot. They looked at these people as an oracle. They looked at these animals as oracles. These bulls were not sacrificed, but were allowed to live a full life and die a natural death. When the Apis bull died, it was given an elaborate funeral after it was embalmed on massive alabaster embalming tables that can still be seen in the ruins of Memphis today. Like a human mummy, its internal organs were placed in large canopic jars, and bull-headed shaptas were provided for it. After the funerary ceremonies, the bull was buried in a huge stone sarcophagus in the Serapeum at Saqqara. The reigning king would officiate the ceremony and dedicate a stone stela as a memorial to the bull. Other animals did not lead such pampered life, and scholars have estimated that perhaps as many as 70 million animals were slaughtered in this practice, which may have gone so far as to drive some species extinct in Egypt. This is, again, their religiosity is driving their culture. These people very much so were believing in these gods. They were consulting animals like the bull, because they looked at it as a god and they thought he could, give them advice. and he was a consultant, right? So again, if anybody tells you that, these ancient Egyptians didn't believe in gods, they didn't believe in this stuff. Come on, man. This is what you got to tell them, man. You got to tell them this. All right, that's all we can say at this point. We get some of these bots out of the damn chat, man. All right, let's keep going. Let's move on to the canopic equipment. The practice of removing internal organs and placing them in separate containers first appeared in the Old Kingdom, 2575 to 2150 BCE. The containers are usually 4 jars roughly carved of limestone or made of pottery with slightly domed stone lids. It is not until later that the jars are given sculpted heads and associated with the four sons of Horus. The term canopic jar is a misnomer and comes from the confusion by early travelers who equated these jars with Osiris Canopus, a form of the god worship in the Nile Delta town where the god is depicted in the shape of a jar with a human head. By the Middle Kingdom, 2030 to 1640 BCE, the jars were given human heads, idolized portraits of the deceased, and carved in Egyptian alabaster or made of ceramic. Some have stoppers made of carved and painted wood, and a few have arms painted or carved into the sides. One from the tomb of Jehudi-Nak at Bersha is of cartonnage with human legs and feet. The jars are inscribed with the name of the deceased and invoke the protection of the four sons of Horus who guard the internal organs. These could also be placed in chests or stone or wood, often made to match the coffin of the deceased. They were placed in the tomb chamber with the coffin or in the niche beside. So obviously these ancient Egyptians believed that these gods were real, so much so that they could protect organs that are in these canopic jars. As we just read, Horus would protect these organs, and we even had some with human legs and feet. Right. To the right, you can see a depiction of these canopic jars. As you can see there, a jar with an image of a god on top of it. I'll keep reading. It says, by the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BC, we see the first appearance of lids that represent each one of the four sons of Horus. The baboon-headed Happy, the guardian of the lungs, the jackal-headed Dua-Mutef, protector of the stomach, the human-headed Imseti, who watched over the liver, and the falcon-headed Qubasanef, who protected the intestines. In addition to the pottery and stone, a very few were made of faience. The jars could also be placed in boxes, and the most elaborate set found was in Tutankhamun's 1336-1327 BCE tomb. The four lids of Tutankhamun's alabaster canopic jars featured his face rather than the sons of Horus, but this seems to be the case with some of the other royal burials of the New Kingdom. Inside the jars were miniature inlaid versions of the pharaoh's second coffin, made to hold the internal organs. The jars are actually carved as part of an alabaster box, which itself was placed in a larger gilded wood canopic shrine. The four sides of the shrine feature the four protective canopic goddesses, Isis, Nephthys, Neith, and Selket, who are also associated with the protection of the viscera and are also shown in the exterior of the sarcophagus. Following the end of the New Kingdom, canopic jars largely disappeared during the Third Intermediate Period, 1070 to 653 BCE, as a cost-saving measure. Instead, the organs are mummified and then returned to the body's cavity. Sometimes wrapped with them are wax protective figures of the four sons of Horus. In addition, in some cases, dummy or false canopic jars are placed in the tomb, which were jars with lids that did not open or jars that had no interior space. The tradition of having the jars had been so ingrained that it was hard to dispense with them altogether. With the returns of prosperity in the 25th dynasty and late period, 664 to 343 BCE, the jars reappear, usually beautifully made of Egyptian alabaster. Giant versions were made for the burials of the sacred Apis bulls in the Serapeum. However, in the declining fortunes of the end of the dynastic era, the jars were replaced by simple, undecorated pottery jars, or the organs were piled in wooden chests instead. Let's deal with the coffins and sarcophagi. However you say that. So I know it's sarcophagus. So sarcophagi, I guess, is the singular version. Sarcophagus may be plural. So let's look at this. It says, because ancient Egyptians deemed the preservation of the body to be a necessity for the spirit to have a continued existence. The protection of the corpse was also important. Egyptians worked to figure out the best way to safeguard the body and keep it safe from the tomb robbers and desert scavengers such as jackals or other animals. Real quick commentary here. So what would that mean for majority of Egyptians? Because not all Egyptians had the luxury of being mummified, buried with these texts, and have these canopic jars so the force on the horse could protect their organs. Not all Egyptians were able to do that. In fact, many of the Egyptians were buried in sand. They were just buried in sand, so their bodies just decomposed. So does that mean in the ancient Egyptian mind that majority of the people that helped build and support Egypt, they themselves would not be able to enjoy the afterlife because they could not afford majority of these luxuries, if you will, that many of the royals or the 1% were able to? For instance, let me see if I can get my Kindle to open. If not, I'll revisit it. But majority of the people, the commoner, would have to be buried in sand. It says here, for majority of the pre-dynastic period prior to about 3000 BCE, bodies were just put into small rectangular or oval pits in the desert. But by the end of this period in Egypt, the Egyptians began to place bodies in reed baskets or plain wooden chests before burying them in the ground. These rectangular boxes were the first true coffins of ancient Egypt. This type of coffin remained little changed until the end of the Middle Kingdom, 2030 to 1640 BCE. Some wooden coffins of the first few dynasties had paneled exteriors that looked like contemporary tombs built of niched brick. In the Old Kingdoms, circa 2575 to 2150 BCE, some of these rectangular coffins were copied in stone and are called sarcophagi. Technically, a stone coffin is known as a sarcophagus. The word comes from the Greek meaning flesh eater because bodies placed in limestone coffins will sometimes take on a charred appearance due to the reaction with the alkaline stone. Ironically, the Egyptians never seemed to take note of the deleterious effect of the stone. In the later Old Kingdom, simpler straight-sided sarcophagi were carved in the limestone or red granite. They had flat or arched lids with protruding bosses on the ends to enable the lid to be maneuvered in place. And there's a sarcophagus to the left there, a coffin to the left, as you guys can see. Says here, with the breakdown of the central government of the first intermediate period, 2150 and 2030 BCE, fine timber was no longer imported into Egypt from the Levant to make large coffins. Instead, caskets were made out of straps of local wood pegged together and covered with veneer or coated with gesso and painted yellow-brown to look like finer wood. These coffins tended to be much narrower than earlier coffins, and the mummies were placed in them on their sides, facing a pair of eyes placed on the outside of the coffin through which the mummy could magically see. So they believe the mummy can actually see through the coffin. Right here it says bands of text inscribed with hieroglyphs are often around the top and sides of the coffin. Beginning above the eyes, the text reads, an offering that the king may give through Osiris, Lord of Busiris, first of the Westerners, Lord of Abydos, on his throne. An offering of beef and fowl, bread and beer to the Ka of the deceased, may he be honored by the great God, the Lord of heaven on his thrones, the deceased. Other inscriptions on the sides and lid of the coffin could invoke the god Anubis and other deities on behalf of the deceased. As I've been saying this whole time, more proof that people are very religious. They thought that if they gave a sacrifice in these burials, then the person dead in the coffin could give that same sacrifice to his gods, to Osiris, and so on and so forth. This was part of the belief system of the ancient Egyptians, right? So I got my Kindle up here to buttress what I said earlier about, I believe it's this book here, majority of ancient Egyptians were buried in sand. See if I can find it real quick. If not, I'll move on. So when we're reading about traveling to the spiritual world, a lot of the semi-free peasants were not able to do that because a lot of these people didn't have money to do it. This is a very expensive thing. So it says they buried their dead in sand as in pre-dynastic times. I found it. Here it is. Here it is. So with that being stated, let me share my Kindle screen real quick so you can see this. That majority of the people they were not able to enjoy this, man. Watch this. Stop that. Share this. Real quick. I'm going to deviate for a little bit here. Share my Kindle. As you can see here. The vast majority of Egyptian people were semi-free peasants. They were somewhat like the serfs of the Western European Middle Ages. They farmed land that belonged to pharaoh temples or members of the upper class. They were not allowed to leave the estates in which they worked, and if the land changed hands, the peasants went with it. Because peasants could not be evicted, though profits for landowners were not as high as they might have been if the land had been unoccupied. Thus, prices for land were very low in the Old Kingdom Egypt, about 2 acres for a cow or its equivalent. The peasants not only supplied the food Egypt needed, they also provided the labor that built Egypt's great monuments. Most peasants lived as their fathers and grandfathers had lived, in small houses and villages just beyond the limits of inundation. They buried their dead in sands as in pre-dynastic times. While they may have hoped for an afterlife because they did not have the money for tombs, mummification, elaborate magical burial site rites, they probably had little confidence that their hopes would be fulfilled. So majority of ancient Egyptians were semi-free peasants. Majority of ancient Egyptians worked for the state. They built the damn monuments and pyramids that you guys are wowed by today. And they had little or nothing to survive on. And they could even enjoy these burial rites and this passage to the afterlife, to the duat, like the royals, because they didn't have the money for it. They could not afford the faience, the wood, the wax, and everything needed to put the organs in the canopic jars, to perform the rites and rituals, to leave papyri behind with the codes and the texts and whatnot, to inscribe these texts and whatever, and inscribe the coffins. They didn't have none of that. To bring sacrifices, these people barely had anything to eat. Why would they go and then bring food sacrifices? Obviously, in the eyes of the Egyptian, a passage to the afterlife was only for the elite. The 1% of Egypt. Right? So with that, let's go back to the book. I just wanted to share that with you guys because, again, many of these people romanticize ancient Egypt as if this utopic paradise that all ancient Egyptians just lived in luxury and, had no worries, right? Hakuna Matata, pretty much, right? Which is far from the truth. Far from the truth. Many of you guys are just glorifying the 1%. Okay? But you never translate that to your audience. But have no fear. Underdog is here. We here. We're going to actually read what is stated in these books. All right? So where did we left? We left off here, right? Yeah, right here. After the portion where it shows that they believe that the dead body in the coffin could see through the coffin. They cut holes where his eyes were, right? So he can actually see outside the coffin. With that being stated, let me keep going. It says, bands of text inscribed with hieroglyphs are written around the top and sides of the coffin, beginning above the eyes. Okay, so we read this. About they believe that they gave sacrifices to and around the coffin, and they thought that the deceased could actually take those sacrifices to the gods in the afterlife. It says within the coffins, masks were placed over the heads of the mummies. These masks were made of cartonnage, which were like paper, but paper mache, but was constructed with linen and papyrus. Over time, these masks grew longer and developed into complete body covers by the end of the Middle Kingdom. These new coffins, which were shaped like the body, are called anthropoid or mummiform coffins and become the standard type in the New Kingdom circa 1550 to 1070 BCE. These coffins were often carved of fine imported hardwood and could be gilded and inlaid with glass and stones. The coffins could be nested with an inner and outer mummy-shaped coffin, or even put into a large rectangular wood coffin. High-ranking people and royalty could also be put into massive stone coffins, which were rectangular or mummy-shaped. The coffin of Bakhmut, generally impoverished, third intermediate period was unraveled when it came to coffin painting. Egyptologist Herbert Winlock compared these coffins to medieval stained glass windows for the colorful rendering of religious scenes. One of the finest is the coffin of Bakhmut, now found in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Bakhmut was a priest of Amun at Thebes during the 21st dynasty, 1070 to 945 BCE, and earliest 22nd dynasty, 945 to 712 BCE. All the symbolism and artistic detail that in more prosperous times would have been lavished on the tomb chapel were concentrated on his coffin. Every inch is covered with religious texts, images of funerary gods and goddesses, protective spells, and amuletic symbols. The deceased is shown as the god Osiris, wrapped as a mummy with his fists protruding from the bandages and wearing the divine beard and long lapped wig of a god. An elaborate floral collar covers the upper half of the body, and a pair of red scapulars is crossed over the chest. The lower body is covered with tiny figures modeled in gessels against a yellow background, which gives the effect of inlaid semi-precious stones, while the varnished yellow surface was intended to look like gold. The wide foot enabled the coffin to stand upright during the opening of the mouth ceremony before it was placed in the tomb. The large coffin was probably the outermost of a nested set, though the inner one is now missing. The decoration of the interior of the coffin base includes images of two deified 18th dynasty kings, Amenhotep I and Thutmose III, who lived centuries before, through the memory of their greatness, was still very much alive. The rest of the coffin is crowded with the other deities in hieroglyphic funerary texts. So again, as you can see, that's very lavish, a very lavish burial. And again, majority of ancient Egyptian people could not afford something like this. Therefore, in the eyes of the ancient Egyptians, they did not have a rite of passage to the afterlife. In other words, the afterlife was very, the populace had to be very small because only a select few of Egyptians would actually be able to pass through or make the passage through. Because, again, majority of the semi-free peasants, majority of ancient Egypt was semi-free peasants. They couldn't afford this, so they buried their dead in the sand, which they didn't have these protective spells. They didn't have sacrifices to give to the gods. They didn't have anything. Let's keep reading. During the impoverished 21st dynasty, 1070 to 944 BCE, coffins were made of a rough local softwood and covered with thick layers of mud and gesso, and embellished with brightly painted decorations, sometimes rendered in gesso to give them a three-dimensional quality. Amuletic devices and vignettes from the Book of the Dead on the exterior of the coffin were covered with the golden yellow varnish. Below the lid was placed a mummy board on a coffin board, an outgrowth of earlier mummies' masks that served as another canvas on which to place additional magical symbols to protect the body. Far more coffins from this period survived than from the New Kingdom, and it's thought that many were removed from their tombs and repurposed and redecorated to be used in other burials when a new coffin was not affordable. Another cost-saving measure was to make the inner coffin out of cartonnage, which a return to prosperity in the 25th dynasty, 712 to 6064 BC, nested sets of large wooden coffins reappear along with a stone sarcophagi. During the late period, 664, 343 BCE, coffins were even more roughly made, and by the time of Cleopatra, 51 to 30 BCE, the Egyptian coffins reflected many of the art styles of the wider Mediterranean world. From there, let's go to cosmology. I really wanted to read the entire bit on religion because, again, these pundits are pretending as if ancient Egypt did not have a religious system. We read about religious reform on the Amenhotep and whatnot, trying to get the entire Egyptian kingdom to worship and reverence and venerate Aten. We read that most of these, they believed in what we're about to get into, the cosmology, and that the canopic jars represented protection from the four sons of Horus, that protected your body in the afterlife. And again, most of the commoners would not be able to afford some of these rich, lavish burials and funerary rites as we have seen so thus far. So let's get into the cosmology. The Egyptians had a number of different conceptions of the cosmos and its creation. According to one creation myth, there was originally just a vast, empty, watery space called Nun, from which a small mound of earth, the Bimbin, arose, and from it grew a blue lotus flower that opened and gave birth to the god Nefertum, or Atum. According to the creation theology of Heliopolis, Atum then begat the air god Shu and his sister, the goddess of rain and moisture, Tefnut. The children of Shu and Tefnut were the god of earth, Geb and Nut, the sky goddess. The Egyptians represents the cosmos, with Geb flying flat on the ground and Nut arched over him and held aloft by Shu. Under the earth was a parallel world known as the Duat, and each day at sunset, the god of Re traveled by boat through the hellish place. After having defeated all the dangers that lurked therein, he was reborn. The souls of the departed could ride along with him in hopes that they would reach the Aru, the field of reeds, where they would lead a pleasant eternal life. The sun god was called upon to defeat the forces of evil and chaos that populated the underworld, to keep them from stopping him and upsetting the balance of Ma'at, the divine balances between good and evil. The Egyptian concept of the journey of the sun god combined their two concepts as the cosmic order, the linear passage of time, and the cyclical pattern. This pattern was clearly influenced by the annual Nile flood, which seemed like a constant replay of the creation myth, with the land arising out of the retreating waters of the inundation year after year. Egyptian gods and goddesses were associated with particular forces of nature, and their daily work together in a concert was necessary to sustain the world order. The concept that the Egyptians held the workings of the cosmos were the result of the actions of the gods has been called cosmotheism. Nothing was taken for granted. Every action and event was somehow divinely inspired. If the gods were to stop orchestrating the daily events of the world, everything would be thrown into chaos and everyone would perish. This would mean that ancient Egypt, this is my commentary here, would be theistic, because they believed gods were involved in day-to-day life of humans and of earth. It says here, to prevent this, it was a king's responsibility, aided by his priests and his people, to maintain Ma'at, the cosmic order, through the proper rituals and sacrifices in the temples. Egypt was believed to be the center of the cosmos, and each and every temple believed itself to be the precise center of the cosmos. The interior of the temple and its construction and decoration represented the ordered, unchanging world, but outside it was surrounded by forces of chaos, and it took daily vigilance to keep the balance between the two in place. Other natural phenomena also informed the ancient Egyptian view of the cosmos. Their vision of the sky was that it was a giant iron roof held up by 4 posts at the centers of the world, and from it hung lanterns, which were the stars. Iron was seen as coming from the sky in the form of meteorites, and the name for the metal was biamimpet, copper from the sky. Celestial phenomena were closely monitored. Egypt also saw the development of the world. Egypt also saw the development of what would become astronomy, but even the Egyptians' early beliefs about the cosmos had a profound effect on the thought of later civilizations, from the Elysian fields of Greek mythology to the Christian concept of hell. All right, so from there, let's go to the funerary figurines and shaptis. Funerary figurines, variously called ushaptis, or shaptis, were included with the burial equipment in ancient Egypt from the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, as substitute laborers for the deceased. And why do you have to have substitute laborers? Because they used to just bury the servants with the king to be his laborers in the afterlife. In other words, his slaves. It would be his eternal slaves, right? The figures were typically inscribed with a spell to magically animate them in the afterlife and were depicted with tools in hand and a basket slung over the shoulder, ready to do any task required of the deceased in the afterlife. Shaptis were made of a wide variety of materials, including faience, clay, metal, and wood. By the third intermediate period, 1070 to 653 BCE, one Shapti was supplied for every day of the year, along with 36 overseers dressed in kilts and carrying a whip in one hand to manage the large workforce. Shout out to Jonathan Amaraswad, man. You just read over this, you glossed over this, you didn't think to bring this out? That they believed that they had to, supply the dead rich royals with slaves and overseers to make sure the slaves were doing their work in the afterlife. You just conveniently left this part out, right? And to the right, there's a depiction of a Shapti right there from the 26th dynasty. The different names given these figures reflect the ancient Egyptian names used for them at different times. The term Shapti is used from the second intermediate period, 1640 to 1550 BC, through the New Kingdom. The word may be derived from the word sawab, a sawab stick, and indeed many of the earliest are roughly carved and are called stick Shaptis. It has also been suggested that the name comes from the shab, the word for the sacred Persea tree from which some may have been carved. The Shawapti is also used in the 17 and 18 dynasty, 1635 to 1295 BC, probably shared similar roots as Shapti. The Ushapti is believed to have been derived from the word washeb, to answer. Shaptis may have originally evolved from statuettes of the seeds made of wood, stone, wax, or clay that were wrapped in linen bandages and placed in miniature coffins. Some later Shaptis also have coffins of their own. Little model figures of the mummy were also placed on the funerary boats and may have also been ancestors of Shapti figures. The first true Shapti figures appear at the end of the Middle Kingdom, circa 2030 to 1640 BC, and are beautifully carved in stone. Some of these early Shaptis are uninscribed, but the 13th dynasty ones with the name of the deceased and early versions of the Shapti spell appear. The Shapti spell is found in chapter 6 of the Book of the Dead and reads as follows. On Shapti, if the Osiris, name of the deceased, be decreed to do any work which is to be done in the cemetery, let everything which stands in the way be removed from him, whether it be to plow the fields or to fill the channels with water or to carry sand from the east to the west. Here am I, you shall say, I shall do it. So they believed it again that these figures would carry on servile work in the afterlife. It says here, not all Shaptis have the spell. Some just have the name and the titles of the tomb owner, and some have no text at all. Most Shaptis are depicted as looking like a rat mummy, but sometimes in the New Kingdom they are shown in everyday dress. Some figures were beautifully painted and crafted in wood or faience, and even had gilded faces. They were placed in elaborately painted Shapti boxes. Shaptis were made for both kings and commoners. Simpler examples in clay or crudely crafted out of wood were made for the less wealthy. There are even clay examples painted blue to look like faience. In the third intermediate period, the number of Shaptis increased dramatically. They were mass-produced in faience. These Shaptis were placed in large boxes of pottery jars or just placed in the tomb floor. The 25th dynasty, 712 to 664 BCE, saw a return of stone Shaptis, both from the officials and the thieves and for kings buried in Nubia. Some of the Nubian royal pyramids had as many as 4,000 Shaptis for just one king. He needed 4,000 servants in the afterlife. Let me keep reading. It says, with the Saneter period, 664 to 525 BC, the Shaptis are made in faience, but far larger and more finely crafted than they had been before. They often have a pale blue or green surface and stand on little planks with a back pillar running up behind like a statue. Small, brightly glazed Shaptis characterize the end of the dynastic period and the beginning of the Ptolemaic period, 304 to 30 BC, but they disappeared altogether. So from there, let's go to funerary furniture. This is how deep these beliefs go. They had to provide furniture too. So we just read they had to provide servants for the deceased royals, right? Had to provide servants. And thank God they stopped the practice of just killing all the servants and burying them with the king. It was like, listen, we're going to just make these clay figurines and they're going to animate and assist you in the afterlife. So, this is a concept, a major concept that these kings and these royals and these people believed in, man. Why are they not teaching you this on Saneter Studio? Maybe because the channel and the pundits are not there to educate its audience, but rather, create this, this quasi Egypt that doesn't exist. Funerary furniture. Depending on a person's wealth and status and the time period in which he or she was buried, the Egyptian tomb could be filled with goods or be nearly bare. The biggest necessity was the coffin, and it was usually the biggest expense. In the magical realm of the tomb, everything would become real, including offerings that were simply listed or depicted on the wall, which would become actual objects represented. So the ancient Egyptians believed everything in that tomb will become real. It will animate. The sacrifices on the wall will become real. Everything written on the walls will become real and of use in the afterlife. It says dummy or false painted wooden or pottery vessels made to look like stone or glass would transform into more valuable material. Food will be left for the spirit on an offering tray in the tomb. And the tomb was marked with a stone or wooden stela or tombstone or with pottery cones recording the name and titles of the owner. And we can see a funerary headrest to the left there. And that's what that's depicting from the 5th dynasty. And it served as a pillow for the living. It says here, how much material was placed in the burial was determined by the status of the tomb owner and by the fashion of the period. In the Old Kingdom, 2575 to 2150 BC, even the wealthiest of burials were sparsely furnished. The tomb of the Queen Teferis, the only intact royal tomb found from the Old Kingdom, contained the remains of a gilded wood bed canopy, a bed, 2 chairs, and boxes, along with some miniature gold vessels and pottery and stone jars and silver bracelets. Lovely things, yes, but one might think that would be more in the tomb of the mother of the builder of the Great Pyramid. So these people believe you have to furnish these tombs because again, everything's going to reanimate in the afterlife and be used by the deceased in the afterlife. So they're like, hey, we need pillows, so they need pillows. They need couches, so they need chairs. So we need to make sure there's a chair there. What if they want to sit down in the afterlife? Let's give them a chair. So this is how they thought, what if he gets sleepy? He's going to need a bed. Let's put a bed in there. In the economically depressed first intermediate period, 2150 to 2030 BC, one finds even less than tombs. Some rough wooden models depicted daily scenes that would have decorated the tomb chapels of the Old Kingdom show, along with a coffin, a walking stick, bows and arrows, and a headrest with a few pottery jars. Even after Egypt was reunited and prospered again in the Middle Kingdom, 2030 to 1640 BCE, the contents of the tomb is spare. Usually just a coffin, a canopy box with jars, and some models in wood or faience, depending on the period. Even the unplundered tombs of some queens and princesses had little more than this, although they were buried with some spectacularly beautiful and finely crafted jewelry. It is not until we get to the 18th dynasty, 1550 to 1295 BC, of the New Kingdom, in the age of conspicuous consumption, that we get tombs stuffed with all manner of household furnishings and ritual objects. Shout out to R1B because that was pretty much y'all dynasty. You understand? The Menahotep's and Thutmosis, they probably were all Ahmosis, were probably all R1B. It says here, sometimes it is said of Tutankhamun's 1336 to 1327 BCE tomb that he was a minor king, and what wealth must have been deposited in the tombs of the great pharaohs like Khufu, 2551, 2528 BCE, or Ramses II, 1279 to 1213 BC. But in fact, probably no other tomb was so lavishly endowed. Not only Not only was it the time when the most objects were placed in the burial, but also Tutankhamun had multiple sets of funerary goods repurposed from his immediate predecessors of the Amarna period. Even private tombs in the 18th dynasty were sumptuously outfitted. Tutankhamen's great grandparents, Yuya and Tuya, had a tomb with breathtaking nested, gilded coffins, furniture, chariots, and all manner of ritual vases and funerary objects. But by the time of Ramses II and his descendants, the tombs were already containing less. By the Third Intermediate Period, 1070 to 653 BCE, we see a lot of the mass interments in the disappearance of the decorated tomb chapels and most funerary furnishings. Even the royal burials are small and containing a lot of goods recycled from earlier tombs. When we get to the late period, 664 to 343 BC, we find there are few, if any, objects in the tomb other than the coffin, canopic jars, Shabti figures, and the statuette of the god Ptah Sokar Osiris containing a Book of the Dead or other funerary papyrus. Still, tombs from most every period were robbed, usually soon after the burial, and often seemingly by someone who knew the disposition of the tomb. Funerary literature. What is commonly referred to as Egyptian Book of the Dead is a collection of spells dealing with the passage of the deceased through the underworld. This collection has its root in very ancient beliefs. Incantations of this type were first found carved on the walls of the burial chambers in the royal pyramids in the late 5th and 6th dynasties. These texts were a seemingly random collection of spells, prayers, ritual instructions, myths, and instructions for the departed king's journey to the afterlife. Later in the Middle Kingdom, 2030 to 1640 BCE, similar inscriptions intended for non-royal individuals were written on the interior of rectangular wooden coffins and are called the coffin texts. Many of these texts are adapted from the pyramid texts, but more clearly describe the next world and all the dangers one would have to pass through to get there. The spells seem to have no established order and are found in random sequence from the tomb to tomb. For they were not written on coffins, but also on tomb walls, funerary state, canopic chests, papyrus scrolls, and mummy masks. The coffin texts have been divided by modern scholars into 1,185 different spells, some of which are categorized under their own subsets, such as the Book of Two Ways, which was a map and description of the underworld. The various spells of the coffin text were titled with the red ink to divide the spells, and some important spells were written entirely in red. As in the pyramid text, we find the mutilation of some signs that could represent a danger to the deceased, such as the hieroglyph for the letter F, the deadly horned viper, which is shown decapitated so it would not present a danger should it magically become real in the afterlife. Again, more religiosity here. With the development of the mummy-shaped anthropoid coffins in the Second Intermediate Period, 1640 to 1550 BCE, in the New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BCE, the text began to be written on papyrus or sometimes on linen instead of on the coffin. These are what is known as the Book of the Dead, but they were called by the ancient Egyptians the Book of Going Forth by Day, because some of the spells were to enable the spirit to gain freedom and ability to leave the tomb by day and go out into the world. That's what that's talking about. So why is it not being mentioned on Saneter Studios? This is what they believed in, that these people could be reanimated and actually go out into the world during the daytime. There could be as many as 200 chapters of spells in any given book to protect the deceased in the afterlife and guide them through the treacherous steps needed to gain eternal life. One of the most critical passages in the Book of Dead is Spell 125, which guides the deceased into the Hall of Judgment to be examined by Osiris. Spell for descending to the broad hall of the two truths. And shall say, Hail to you, great God, Lord of justice. I have come to you, my Lord, that you may bring me so that I may see your beauty. For I know you, and I know your name, and I know the names of the 42 gods of those who are with you in the hall of justice, who lives on those who cherish evil and who gulp down their blood on that day of the reckoning. I have not done falsehood against men. I have not impoverished my associates. I have done no wrong in the place of truth. I have not learned that which is not. I have done no evil. I have not daily made labor in excess of what was to be done for me. My name has not reached the offices of those who control slaves. I have not deprived the orphan of his property. I have not done what the gods detest. I have not slandered a servant or his master. I have not slandered a servant to his master. I have not caused pain. I have not made hungry. I have not made weep. I have not killed. I have not turned anyone over to a killer. I have not caused anyone suffering. I have not diminished the food offerings in the temples. I have not debased the offering cakes of the gods. I am pure. I am pure. I am pure. I am pure. My purity is the purity of this great phoenix that is in the Heracleopolis, because I indeed the nose of the Lord of wind, who made all men live in that day of completing the sacred eye in Heliopolis. And nothing evil shall come into being against me in this land, in this hall of justice, because I know the names of these gods who are in it. So after we read that long, drawn out spell, as you can see, this is very important and pertinent to the ancient Egyptians, that they had these spells to protect them and guide them in the afterlife. And they, probably thought they were going to recite this, in the afterlife, right? To gain protection of the chief god and the other 42 gods, as we just read was mentioned. In addition to these spells written on papyrus scrolls, some spells were also copied onto other funerary objects such as amulets and shaptis. One important spell, 30b, prevented the heart from self-incrimination during the weighing of the heart in the final judgment. It was written on a scarab or heart-shaped amulet that was placed on the chest to silence the heart. The Papyrus of Ani. The Papyrus of Ani is one of the largest and most beautiful copies of the Book of the Dead. It was found at Thebes and caught the attention of the British Museum Keepers of Antiquities, E.A. Wallace Budge, who did everything he could to possess it, even it is said tunneling into the storeroom where it was kept. The papyrus was written in the cursive hieroglyphics and copiously illustrated that vivid colored miniatures. And he was a scribe who lived in Thebes during the 19th dynasty, 1295 to 1186 BCE. Before shipping the manuscript to England, Budge cut the 78-foot long scroll into 37 sheets. He used a yardstick to cut it, slicing through text and even scenes. Budge did publish it in a large format folio color facsimile. The papyrus is now probably the most well-known and widely published of all the books of the dead. Continuing here, it says many of the chapters in the papyri had brightly colored illustrations, particularly those made in the New Kingdom papyri, which are sometimes referred to as vignettes. Just as with the inscriptions, however, these scenes are not uniformly distributed and show considerable variety. They were also frequently used in coffin decoration, particularly in the 21st dynasty, 1070 to 945 BCE. Other funerary texts also appear later on, such as the Litany of Re, the Amduat, and the Book of Breathings. They're all known collectively as underworld books. It has been suggested that these texts influenced the archaic and classical Greek conceptions of afterlife as it is depicted in the Odyssey and even in the Christian concept of hell. All right, so we're going to end it there. I think we did a good job. We're after the 2-hour mark. I want to keep this watchable, so I'm going to stop it here. Hope you guys enjoyed that. You learned something from it, because you're not going to learn anything from these pundits on ancient Egypt. Pundits on Saneter Studios are not going to teach you about ancient Egypt. They want to keep making these statements, and these delusions of grandeur, as we've read, that these people are very religious. They believe that they had to do these things to protect themselves in the afterlife. They had to cast these spells to protect themselves. And these royals want to bring servants with them. So at first they would kill their servants and bury them with them so they can, be servants in the afterlife or be slaves in the afterlife. Then they started to use shaptis, which are like figurines that should reanimate and assist them in the afterlife. So all these beliefs culminate to show that these guys are very religious. They believed in the gods. They answered to the gods. They went to, bulls and pretty much, for consultation, for advice. So obviously they believed in these things, man. So y'all know how we rock it, man. 7 candlesticks up. Hit that subscribe button. Go subscribe to our other channel, the Yap Gang Scholarship. There will be exclusive content there. Hibachi, Osaka, it's over with, man. These guys are cooked. And that concludes our series on Saneter Studios, Misrepresents Ancient Egypt. And if you, after studying all this, still believe that somehow that these people are atheists and they didn't have a religion and they didn't believe in gods, with that being said, we do have a word from our sponsors.
Butterfly in the sky, I can go twice as high. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. I can go anywhere, friends to know and ways to grow, a reading rainbow. I can be anything. Take a look, it's in a book, a reading rainbow. A reading rainbow. A reading
God up. Wanna keep on start up.
Once again, I'm locked in with TP. We finna make a hit.
I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. Keep clutching my 5 stick, we checking niggas challenge, yo. You won't see me leave outside the house without my helmet. And my little niggas banging shots, the gang in Alabama. Hey, they let me squeeze a bust his cherry, clip hold a banana. Shit, I still can't wait to pull up on the block, Ryan found him. And I'm sliding like a sled in the snow, but I ain't sound him. My hoe know her head fast, she get to showing out for the camera. I beat it bad like Michael Jackson, think this my dirty Diana. Hey, how you let her snake up in the grass, sneak up in the house? So we get them bowls in, T to P gon' take them out. Key and Glock up on me now because I chose the paper route. You niggas better use a GPS and take the safer route. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. We with it today, we with it today. It's just me and baby Shiesty and we too deep in the race. Yeah, we with it today, we with it today. It's just me and baby Shiesty and we too deep in the race. Said the Draco came with side effects, I told her baby K. Who won't smoke with me, I pull up anytime at any day. This is not a 223, the chopper here shoot 308. Get that workout like a fitness room, you know we moving weight. Been feeling like my birthday every day, wake up and get the cake. Hey, I was smoking out the P, weighing up ounces, smoking shake. No, I can't never let a nigga slide, I can't let him skate. Shots fired, he on Fox Live, bullet to your face. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. I just crossed another nigga over, tell him guard up. Double tap the button up on the key, the car gon' start up. I lost some members at the early age, it let me start up. Chopper gang, the bandit sticks and drums when we march up. Big brr.